Chapter 6. First, of course, we took tea. Then, complicity and friendship sealed over the soothing hot beverage and its accompanying marmalade tarts. Lady Theodora called for Lady Cecilia's personal maid, who escorted me to the Honourable Lady Cecilia's rooms. The usual things for gentry is to have one's bed in a room with a dressing closet, behind another room where servants and friends came in and out. I walked straight through to look at Lady Cecilia's bedchamber and appeared at first glance to be sweetness itself, with a carved and daintily painted sleigh bed, more suitable, I thought, for a girl than a young lady. Perhaps her mum had tried to keep her a baby. In a corner sat the usual dollhouse, meant to encourage domestic pride, but it did not look as if Lady Cecilia enjoyed that sort of thing any better than I did. Her expensive china and porcelain dolls stood neglected on the shelves, dusty even inside their glass cases. Nor, I thought, glancing at similar glass bells on the mantelpiece, did she enjoy the genteel craft of moulding roses out of coloured wax. "Did Lady Cecilia make those herself?" I asked the maid to be sure. "Yes, ma'am. My young lady is, well versed in all handicrafts." The wax flowers looked more like shapeless blobs. On the walls hung small, framed pastels, old woman knitting by the fire, country maiden with a basket of eggs, rosy-cheeked child holding a puppy, etc. "Did Lady Cecilia draw those?" "Yes, ma'am. Lady Cecilia is quite the artist." Debatable, I thought, even as I nodded. The pastels, like the wax flowers, appeared colourful but uncertain, their lines and forms much blurred. "Lady Cecilia had voice lessons too, and ballet. In every way she is most accomplished. Fit for the marriage market, in other words, as my brother wanted me to be. A singing, dancing, French-quoting, delicately fainting decoration to any aristocratic drawing-room. I wonder how Lady Cecilia felt about her accomplishments. Aside from the sleigh bed, I saw a similarly ornate wardrobe, a dresser, and a washstand in the young lady's bedroom. On the dresser stood the usual set: ring stand, silver embossed comb and brush, hand mirror, cut glass toilet, water bottles, hair tidy. I glanced into the wardrobe, scanning the usual apparel of an aristocratic miss. Morning dresses, afternoon dresses, visiting dresses, Sunday best, evening gowns, riding habit, cycling costume, tennis dress, ad infinitum. "Has it been ascertained what Lady Cecilia was wearing at the time of her departure?" "Yes, ma'am. It would seem that The maid blushed. "She was garbed for slumber, ma'am. Nothing else is missing." "Indeed. Was a bed slept in?" "Yes, ma'am. One window faced the back of the house, and one faced the side." "At which of these was the ladder placed?" The maid indicated the one at the back of the house, out of view of the street. "And the window was found open?" "Yes, ma'am." "Were any windows or doors downstairs opened?" "No, ma'am. The downstairs doors were locked and barred, and the windows snibbed." "But these windows were not snibbed?" "No, ma'am. The lady sounded as if she pitied my ignorance. To improve their health, all members of the baronet's family sleep with the window slightly raised, ma'am. Winter or summer, ma'am." Unsurprisingly, I myself had been raised the same way. Ventilation strengthened the moral resolve of one's digestion and so forth against disease, and guarded one's personage against laxness. Therefore, even during the coldest weather fit to frost one's nightcap, a window had to be left open an inch or so. "So the window sash could have been raised by someone on the ladder outside?" "Yes, ma'am. And it was left that way, wide open with a ladder at the sill?" "Yes, ma'am." I backtracked into Lady Cecilia's boudoir, a sizable room lavished with mirrors, chairs, settees, a needlepoint fire screen. Lady Cecilia's accomplishment, no doubt. Potted ferns in the bay window and near the source of light, Lady Cecilia's easel and art stand. And, I thought, at the time, more important, a roll-top desk. I opened the desk first. "Some letters were found in here, I understand?" "Yes, ma'am. The police took them, ma'am." "Did they search the desk for other documents?" "No, ma'am." The maid sounded shocked. "Lady Theodora discovered the letters and took them downstairs to the offices." "In other words, no detective had been allowed to set foot in these rooms." "Quite so," I said approvingly, as I seated myself at the desk to have a look. Fervently I wished I could have seen the letters themselves, not only for content but also for any indications Scotland Yard might have overlooked. Were the postage stamps positioned oddly or reversed? If so, it would suggest a code. The letters did not come from the post, ma'am. I shocked the maid again. Probably the formidable butler oversaw postal correspondence. How so, then? By hand, obviously, but by whose hand? We, uh, we do not know, ma'am. With the complicity of one of the servants, in other words. Perhaps this very lady maid, Lily by name, and the line of inquiry had already been exhausted. The surface of the desk was occupied by an exquisite writing set, ink bottle and fountain pens, pen holder and letter opener of all jade. In the drawers, along with the usual blotting paper, pen wipers and such, I found the lady's monogrammed stationery and several sticks of sealing wax in different colours. Red for business correspondence, blue for constancy and love, grey for friendship, yellow for jealousy, green for encouragement of a shy lover, violet for condolences. But only the grey stick of wax looked much used. Also in the drawers I found Lady Cecilia's address book, well kept in the petite curlicue handwriting of an aristocratic miss. I found sundry other papers, shopping lists, reminders of social obligations, moral exhortations themed around the letters of the alphabet, that sort of thing. Much more important, I found a stack of journals. Lady Cecilia kept diaries. The silk-covered journals were equipped with tiny padlocks. Yes, ma'am. But the padlocks had been broken open. Did the police look at these? No, ma'am. Lady Theodora, then? Yes, ma'am. In the mirror, ma'am. I beg your pardon? But as I spoke, I took one of the books, opened it, and gawked at the handwriting therein. Large, childishly plain, and all slanted leftward, utterly unlike the handwriting of the address book and other papers. It made no sense to me until I realized it was written from right to left, its words running from right to left down, with even the letters reversed, so that B looked like D. How peculiar! I exclaimed, getting up. I held the diary open towards a standing mirror, in which I could easily read. Most frightfully cold. I am wearing no less than 9 petticoats. As a cipher, this backwards writing was hardly worth bothering with. Why in the world did she write that way? I don't know, ma'am. Did you ever see her do it? No, ma'am. Like any loyal servant, of course, she had seen nothing. There were 80 diaries, all of them in the same odd leftward writing, unchanged over a period of years. Settling upon the most recent diary, the only one with blank pages at the beginning, actually, as the diaries had been written from back towards the front, I turned to the first entry, then held it to the mirror and read. January 2. I am so dreadfully bored. How can anyone talk of New Year's resolutions when no amount of good intentions ever seem to alleviate the suffering in this world? And how can they chatter of perfumes and parties, flounces and necklines and dancing slippers, when the streets swarm with orphans and pauper children, who have barely even rags to wear nor shoes for their feet, while their fathers cannot find work and their mothers labor 16 hours a day in the mills? And while I, in order to be presented to the Queen, practice walking backwards without tripping over a 9-foot train. Mine is a life without any worthwhile purpose, without value, empty of meaning. Hardly the sentiments of a young woman about to elope with a secret lover. With a mind full of conjecture, I left Lily to replace items in the desk while I crossed the room to see what Lady Cecilia had been drawing lately. On an easel I found an undersized and unfinished pastel of a country landscape, already turning into a shapeless mass of candy-coloured smudge. Atop her art stand lay her pastels, broken. Pink, peach, pale green, aqua, sky blue, lavender, powdery brown, all broken to jagged bits. Most interesting. I pulled open the drawer of her art stand, finding about what one might expect. Pencils, erasers, India ink, and art pens still in their box. And, not in a box, sticks of charcoal. Stubs, rather, with blunt tips. Dirtying all the contents of the drawer with black powder, the way soot besmirched London City. Quantities of charcoal lay everywhere, worn to nubbins. I blinked at the pastel daub on the easel, not a hint of black in it, anywhere. I looked around at the walls and found them innocent of any black artwork. After closing the drawer, I crossed to where the maid was tidying the desk. Lily, where are Lady Cecilia's charcoal drawings? Charcoal? Moving the jade items of the lady's writing set from one end of the desk to the other, she would not look at me. I am sure I have no idea, ma'am. I was equally sure that she did, but there was no use saying so. Instead, imagining where I would put artwork if I didn't want anyone to see it, I went back into the lady's bedchamber and started peering behind furniture. In the back of both the dresser and the wardrobe, I could see sheets of heavy paper, quite large, leaning against the wall. "Lily," I called, "you'd better help me get these out, unless you want me to smear them." Suddenly, the girl came and helped me push the furniture a few inches away from the walls, so that I could reach behind. Taking the papers by their edges, I carried them to the other room in order to look at them in the light. One by one, I placed them on the easel where their size dwarfed that of the pastel. Not only their size, I scarcely know how to explain. Their temper, one might call it. Nothing could have been more unlike the pinky, bluey blurs that had been framed to hang on the walls. These charcoal drawings were rendered in heavy black strokes, knife-sharp and direct, shockingly unsoft by any shading. But the subjects were even more shocking. Scrawny, filthy children playing in a gutter beneath a clothesline strung with dead fish, hatless women standing over a street lamp at night to sew, an unshaven man picking up cigar butts, an Italian family singing for pennies, a barefoot boy kneeling on the cobbles to shine a gentleman's shoes, a ragged woman with a sickly baby selling matches door to door, and many more. People from the poorest streets of London. People depicted so boldly, so surely, with such unblinking honesty that they could not possibly have been done from imagination. One who was born to be an artist had seen them to draw them. I knew that feeling of fiery connection between eyes and heart and hand. An inspired artist had looked upon these people with passion, as I looked upon them with passion. Several of the drawings showed starved old women dozing in the workhouse steps. The poorest of these poor, those crawlers of dosses, seldom found strength to move. I knew them, and so evidently did Lady Cecily. But how? Chapter 7. Dr. Ragston will contact you discreetly, I told Lady Theodora, with his thoughts upon the matter. It was fortunate that Dr. Ragston was to supply the thoughts, for mine were in a muddle worse than the most tangled yarn basket that ever was. Out of all in the Gordian knot, I seized upon only one strand surely, a grey one, another indication that Lady Cecily had not eloped. If a secret correspondence with the shopkeeper's son had developed into a passionate affair, she would have used a rainbow of sealing wax, other than the grey. No, she had written her letters only in friendship. She had gone off not for love, but for some other reason, which I sensed had something to do with her odd diaries, the mirror writing, and something, although I could not even begin to imagine what, something to do with her extraordinary charcoal drawings. The latter were so unladylike and disturbing both in their bold execution and in their choice of subjects, that I had to put them back behind the bedroom furniture, and had not mentioned them to Lady Theodora, not yet, if ever. The diaries, however, I wished to take with me. For my eyes only, I assured the lady, when I had a chance to speak with her privately. Reporting to her dressing room, I had found her busy with the younger children, 2 little boys and a little girl romping around her chamber like puppies, while she inspected a somewhat older girl for kempt hair, cleanly ears, etc. The girl's face reminded me very much of Lady Cecily as I had seen in the photographic portraits Lady Theodora had showed me over tea. Indeed, all of the children, including Lady Cecily, much resembled their mother. Generous mouth, brilliant, intelligent eyes. Lady Theodora shooed the young Alistairs back to the care of their governess when I came in, and beckoned for me to sit close to her. I will myself read the diaries, I explained to her, after making my request, and inform Dr. Ragston in the most discreet terms of any indications I may find. I have looked through them, Lady Theodora responded, and found nothing that seemed harmful, but by all means, if you think it will help, you will take the greatest care of them. I assured her I would, remembering just in time to ask her also for a recent portrait of Lady Cecily, so that Dr. Ragston could see what the missing miss looked like. Also, I copied down the name and address of the shopkeeper's son with whom Lady Cecily had been corresponding, in case Dr. Ragston wished to question him. As I departed, Lady Theodora embraced me, kissing my cheek with the most unexpected strength of feeling. Therefore I felt quite wretched and like a shameful fraud as I took a cab back to Dr. Ragston's office. Dr. Ragston this, Dr. Ragston that. I was a liar, and finding this lost girl was up to me? A runaway upstart of 14? True, half the domestics and mill hands in London were my age, or younger, and true also that any of us who committed a crime would be imprisoned, tried, and hanged right along with Jack the Ripper should the police ever find him. But we had no rights. None, not even a right to the money we earned, until we turned 21. Legally, at age 14, I did not yet exist. So who on earth did I think I was? Enola Ivy Holmes Meshel Miss Ragaston? To attempt the monstrous hoax that was my life. Such were my thoughts as I slipped through the secret entry into the locked room where I transformed myself back into Ivy Meshel. My subdued frame of mind lasted through the rest of the afternoon into the evening, when I returned to my lodging, with Lady Cecilia's casement, photograph, and journals done up, as if I had been shopping, in a brown paper parcel tied with string. After Mrs. Tupper had provided me with a meal of herring stewed with parsnips, most unhelpful to one attempting to grow plump, I retreated upstairs to my room, made myself comfortable in warm socks and a dressing gown, settled myself in my armchair by the hearth, and with the aid of a hand mirror began to read Lady Cecilia's most recent diary. The content was not at all what one might expect from a baronet's daughter. I found nothing about Sunday phaeton rides in Hyde Park, holidays at the seaside, shopping along Regent Street, the latest fashions in millinery, or even a mention of a new dress. Nor did I find any accounts of diversions with her friends. Instead, the entries were mostly troubled musings. A great deal of talk about the poor law, the deserving poor versus those who are undeserving. Unfortunates who had been blinded, crippled, etc., through no fault of their own, are regarded as worthy of charitable aid, but all those who are physically able, Daddy says, must be morally deficient, lazy, and undeserving of consideration. The beggars should continue to be whipped out of town as had been the custom, or else go to the workhouse. But if work is such a great good, why then does the workhouse punish its inmates with dinners of thin gruel after their long hours of the hardest possible labour? Social Darwinism and the survival of the fittest would hold that there is no such category as deserving poor. Those who had showed themselves unable to support themselves should be let alone as nature takes its course, eliminating them, making way for a superior human race, of which we of the titled classes, I suppose, are examples. Because we can quote Shakespeare, play Chopin upon the piano, and keep our gloves clean while taking tea. What of the babies? For the most part, the poverty-stricken people who are succumbing to Darwin's selective process have already reproduced. By this way of thinking, should the babies also be abandoned to perish? The great unwashed of the East End are not themselves intellectually capable of organizing unions and marches, Daddy declares. Some outside influence, very likely foreign and enemy, must be to blame for the disturbances, and the police are fully justified in blooding heads in order to put a halt to any further and more serious uprisings. He does not deny that the mill workers live in fever nests unfit for pigs and toil until they fall down like galley slaves under the whips of heartless foremen. But he does not seem to feel that they deserve any better. He does not seem to feel that there are people like us at all. It is so difficult for me to sit and fold my hands in my lap, smile sweetly, and listen. After reading this, and much more, I still consider myself a fraud, for my weary brain, while sympathetic to Lady Cecilia's point of view, could make nothing practical of it. Slumber, I decided, was needful. Sleep would knit up the unravelled sleeve of care, to quote some Shakespeare myself, or in this case, sleep would tidy my yarn-basket mind. Thus, without admitting that I was afraid, I excused myself from venturing forth in habit, and black cow that night. Instead, I went to bed. Awakening what seemed like a moment afterward, I found that it was morning. Somehow, while I had slept so soundly, unusual for me, the muddle in my mind had indeed sorted itself out a bit, so that a thread of reasoning presented itself to me thus. I had come to London, I had seen London's poor, I had felt impelled to help them. Lady Cecilia, by the evidence of her charcoal drawings, also had seen. I did not yet know how this highly irregular encounter had come to pass, nor did I know whether it had happened before or after her questioning journal entries. But somehow, and I must find out how, the young lady had walked amongst London's poor. Had she also felt impelled to help them? Had she perhaps felt home of her own free will? Left home of her own free will? Settling into my office to work as Ivy Meshel, I read the morning newspapers. Finding no communication from Mum, I tossed the news of the day into the fire, then rang for tea. Meanwhile, in a contemplative frame of mind, I got out Lady Cecilia's photographic portrait and a sheaf of foolscape paper. Referring to the portrait, I penciled a quick likeness of the lady. Then, putting the photograph away, I drew a head and profile, recalling other photographs I had seen of her, combining those memories with my observations of her mother and brothers and sisters, all of whom so strongly resembled one another. Over and over again I sketched Lady Cecily, with no aristocratic finery, just the face, from various angles until I began to feel that I had met her in person. Deep in my work, I had not noticed Juddy entering the office with my tea. Unaware of the boy's presence, I jumped when his piping voice spoke from behind my shoulder. "I didn't know you could draw like that." It was not his place to comment, but luckily it took me a startled moment to catch my breath before I told him so. And in that moment he spoke again. "I know her," he declared, setting down the tea tray, then pointing to my portraits of Lady Cecily with his stubby white-gloved finger. Ridiculous. He could not possibly. Wait a minute. Indeed? I tried not to show how interested I was, for like any servant, he would draw himself into a shell if I questioned him too sharply. I kept my tone carefully neutral. "What is her name?" "I don't know her like that. I've seen her some places, oh." "Where, pray tell?" "I don't remember." I swiveled to observe him. There he stood, with faraway gaze, as if trying to recall a dream. "Was she in a carriage?" He shook his head slowly, looking puzzled, before he remembered his manners. "No, Miss Meshel. She was standing on a corner like—" "Where? Piccadilly, Trafalgar Square, Seven Dials? I don't know." "But then, doing what? Shopping?" "No, I don't think so." Uncertain, my patience beginning to wear thin, I grumbled. "Selling matches? A ridiculous notion, for only beggars sold matches." But looking mildly startled, Joddy murmured, "Matches? Strike." Being-headed boy, of course, one strike a match in order to light it. Restraining myself from rolling my eyes and trying to keep my impatience out of my tone, I tried another question. "What was she wearing?" Of course, he did not answer what I had asked. "She had something in a basket," he said, as did half the populace of London, I thought, and the other half had something in a barrow. Common folk living penny in hand to pastry in mouth, most of them lacking icebox to keep food or stove to prepare dinner, eating sooty messes they bought from street vendors, the poor living off the poor. "Something in a basket? What?" I asked, utterly surprised and a bit sarcastic, for surely the flea-brained boy had to be mistaken. "Roly-poly puddings?" "No, Miss Meshel, nothing like that. I think it were papers." "You think you saw this girl selling newspapers?" I should have kept my mouth closed, for at the very least my tone under better control. "No, no, Miss Meshel." Frightened into stupidity, Jolly would be of no further use. Indeed, after a few more attempts, I found that there was nothing more to be got out of him. "That would do. Thank you, Jolly." After he left, I muttered several naughty things in a low tone, then dismissed the episode from my mind. The frustrated, addle-pated boy had probably seen some other pretty girl. Sipping my tea, and I admit, admiring my own artwork for a few minutes before I burned it in the fire, I continued to mull over the matter of the missing Lady Cecily. I discarded the absurd notion that she had eloped, for reasons already mentioned, and also because she would hardly have gone off in a nightgown. Rather, in preparation for such a romantic escapade, she would have been waiting in a most fetching frock. But supposing her escapade, rather than being romantic, had involved any of the poorer neighbourhoods of London, well, the essence remained the same. She would not have gone in a nightgown. Had she perhaps secreted some other, more humble apparel for herself, and hidden the nightgown to make it appear— What? That she'd been snatched from a bed by a kidnapper, and forcibly carried down a ladder? Nonsense, impossible in my experience of ladders. Had the ladder been placed at a window as a blind? If she had gone away on her own, how had she travelled? Had anyone assisted her? I had too many questions and not enough answers. Presently I rang the bell again. Jolly, I told the boy in buttons when he appeared. Go fetch me a cab. Miss Mashall was going shopping, but not at any of the establishments I normally frequented. I had the cab, which cost sixpence a mile, drop me at the nearest railway station, much less expensive as I had to travel some small distance to a northern part of London where I particularly wanted to visit a certain commercial establishment, Ebenezer Finch and Son Emporium. Exiting this train at St. Pancras Station, a frothy architectural confection if I ever saw one, I walked a few blocks. As Ivy Meshel, an ordinary office worker whose skirt, while decently concealing her ankles, did not trail in the dirt, I attracted leers instead of glares. This time the top-hatted gentleman took no notice of me at all, and no one suggested that it would be my own fault if I came to harm. But male clerks ogled from shop doorways, and a working-class loiterer spoke to me. "How do you do, sweetheart? What's your hurry? Stop and chat a bit." Pretending I had not heard, without so much of a glance, I strode past him. Thank goodness he did not follow, as had been known to happen. Indeed, a slop girl walking in the slums enjoyed more peace than any decent female on city streets. I found it necessary to ignore several other male pests before I finally spied my destination. Approaching Ebenezer Finch and Son Emporium, I felt my eyes widen, for I never had seen such capacious bow windows flanking the door of a shop, or so many polished brass dress forms upon which were displayed the latest straight-belt fashions, in, I might add, the most startling of chemically deprived colours. Walking inside provided even more of a shock to my sensibilities. One must understand that shopping as I knew it consisted of entering a stationer's dark little establishment, or an apothecary's or a draper's, for instance, and telling the fusty, black-suited man behind the counter that of his particularly merchandise one wanted, upon which he would either bring an item forth from storage or else take down an order. Shopping was logical and dull. But this Ebenezer Finch and Son Emporium, brilliantly gaslit even in the daylight, was so far from dull that it arrested the logical workings of the mind. Its merchandise flaunted, attracted, distracted, dazed. On the panelled walls and the varnished wooden countertops, and even hanging from the ceiling, were displayed an astounding variety of wares. Bolts of fabric and trimming, hats, gloves and shawls, tools and padlocks, wooden toys and tin soldiers, kitchen cutlery of all sorts, buckets and watering cans, caps and aprons, and wrought iron coat hooks, china figurines, fancy ware, flowers and ribbons, swags of lace and chiffon. It was as if I had stepped into an ocular whirlpool. At first, saturated with colour, sheen and fluttered, I could scarcely make sense of my surroundings. It was as if, everywhere I looked, something shiny attempted to steal away my vital principle, like a mesmerist's watch winking on its chain. But exerting an effort of will to sort out the spectacle before me, I began to notice that different categories of items were stored and displayed in different areas, attended by different clerks, many of them female clerks. I saw with relief behind counters that seemed to stretch for a mile. The shop was necessarily quite large, scarcely to be called a shop at all. Indeed, this was my first experience of what came to be known as a department store. I wondered what constant exposure to this place might do to those who worked here. Hatters went mad and painters became poisoned, labourers in cotton mills grew stunted, as if they did not sicken and die. This emporium also seemed somehow unhealthy to me. How might such a plethora of pretty things affect, if not the body, then the mind? In a prominent position just inside the door was displayed a photographic portrait of the proprietor, Ebenezer Finch and Son. Once I had managed to rein in my runaway thoughts, I studied this likeness with interest, not so much in Ebenezer Finch as in Son. Alexander Finch, shopkeeper's son of impudent fame, alleged seducer of Lady Cecily Alistair. Chapter 8. Within the ornately framed photograph, he appeared ordinary enough, indeed so nondescript as to give one the impression that one had seen him somewhere else before, an effect no doubt produced by the blankness of expression that is required in order to hold a pose for a camera. Wandering further into the kaleidoscopic depths of this shop, I looked about me, ostensibly for something to buy, but actually for Mr. Alexander Finch. I wanted to assess him, to arrive at some conclusion concerning his character, to guess at the degree of his involvement, if any, in Lady Cecilia's disappearance. As luck would have it, I found him almost immediately, for a loud, hectoring voice caught my attention. "Alexander, a monkey could dress them windows better." Looking towards the source of this ungrammatical statement, I located an office, rather an octopus affair, with mnemonic payment and receipt tubes running into it from all areas of the shop. Evidently the proprietor's office, elevated in the emporium's farthest corner. Through its largest windows, presumably meant for keeping an eye on commerce, I could see Ebenezer Finch haranguing his son. "Sort of colours one would expect from a screaming anarchist." The father was blustering as he stabbed an accusing finger at his son. "Get them changed into something more tasteful straight away." "Yes, sir." Standing with his hands folded in front of him, the younger Finch showed not the least emotion, not even a trace of angry red on his face. "But you're not to set a foot an inch beyond the doorstep, do you hear me?" "Yes, sir." "Expedite the matter, and tell me when you're done." Dismissed, Mr. Alexander Finch gave a nod and exited the office. By taking a few quick strides, I contrived to encounter him at the bottom of the brass-railed stairs, leading down to the main floor of the store. Rather breathlessly, I addressed him. "Excuse me, Mr. Finch. May I help you, miss?" Halting to face me, he seemed pleasant and obliging enough. A bit dandified, perhaps. He wore tinted eyeglasses indoors, and instead of the usual sober garb of a clerk, he had on a peacock blue ascot with a horseshoe pin, a silver grey waistcoat with white buttons, and very smart cufflinks indeed. His was the male equivalent of the fashionable but inexpensive clothing that ornated Miss Meshel. If he were a seducer, perhaps, he would show some interest in me. Nonsense. And any comparison to me was hardly fair to Lady Cecilia, who was not giraffe-like in personage. I told Alexander Finch, "Sir, I find myself quite bewildered in such a palatial establishment, graced by such variety of wares, and I wonder whether you might show me." Then I let my voice sink to a murmur only he could hear. "Lady Theodora Alistair sent me to speak with you." My heart quickened as I watched how he would react, but he barely reacted at all, showing only the faintest flicker of surprise, from which he recovered quickly, falling into my charade. "If you'll walk this way, miss, I'll be pleased to assist you." He led me back through the store, past a counter where an attractive female clerk stood behind absurdly disembodied carved wooden hands displaying gloves, past another where a spinisterish woman exhibited cast-iron hearths set to husband and wife. Past several more until he reached one where a willowy young working girl stood. To her he said, "Disappear." Although his tone was low and neutral, she fled, wide-eyed without a smile or a word. In fear? But perhaps such was her usual manner with him. She was, after all, a doe-eyed young thing, and he was the master's son. Himself slipping behind the now vacant counter, Mr. Alexander Finch told me, "Here we have the very latest fashions of ladies' footwear." It would have attracted attention, you see, appearing disreputable, had I simply stood and talked with him, but we could converse over a countertop, and to any onlooker it might seem that he was strictly attending to business, waiting upon me. I wasted no time. "Lady Theodora is taking matters into her own hands," I explained, or fictionalized, to see what the fair sex, in an unofficial way, could accomplish in searching for the missing Lady Cecilia. "Quite so. Something for spring, you say?" Pulling open some of the many deep drawers beneath and behind the counter, he brought forth a fawn-coloured boot with a delicate heel, a pearl grey one that buttoned up the front instead of the side, and a tan one with laces. The boots were of excellent quality and quite lovely, but I only pretended to look at them, as I told him. "No doubt you think it foolish, but Lady Theodora feels we must try. You see, the police have been of no help." "I'd say not. All they do is watch me, and my father's so vexed with me, he won't let me out of the door." He said this just as imperturbably as he said anything else. So far I had gained no sense of him, none at all, whether for good or for ill. "Do you live at home with your parents?" I asked, for lack of any better question. No, I stay with other clerks. No doubt in a dormitory above the store. Well, you've some respite from your father's vexation then. Why is he angry with you? Because I forget my place, as he calls it, treating people all much the same. He gestured towards a bentwood chair placed on my side of the counter. Would you care to have a seat, my lady? Oh no, I said rather abruptly, because my knees weakened. I don't, such a title. Well, the quality of your speech says you are not what you appear to be, either. While not titled by birth, perhaps not one to be presented at court, I was a squire's daughter, and as such, a member of the gentry, one who does not work for money, and my accent, if not my clothing, betrayed my rank. Sitting with my mouth airing, I scolded myself internally. I must be more careful. This was why I decided the nocturnal system must be mute, because my distinctive voice might give me away. At the same time, I began to understand why Lady Cecilia might have entered into a correspondence with this young man. Beneath his bland exterior lay a great deal of intelligence, and some other less definable qualities. Indeed, for a moment I felt quite uncomfortable as he leaned on his elbows, studying me through his tinted spectacles, which made it difficult for me to see his eyes or read their expression. As I started to turn away from his scrutiny, the young man almost smiled. For a moment there was a flicker of some realization, knowledge or triumph, in his smirk. He said, I do believe we have met. What, may I ask, is your name? Certainly you may ask, I told him, controlling my tone as best as I could. A moment passed before I understood that I would not answer. Then he seemed to drop the subject entirely. I personally feel that bootlaces are far superior to buttons, he remarked, holding up the tan boot. They obviate the tendium of the buttonhook, and would mould the leather more closely to the limb of the wearer, which should not have been desirable or necessary, were the lower extremities not meant to be seen. After all, a glimpse, now and then, as this young man knew quite well, though I felt a bit odd hearing him insinuate so. As he spoke, he yanked upon the laces to demonstrate their function, for all the world like a maid pulling down stay laces, giving the boot a wasp waist where an ankle should have been. I barely looked. Indeed, my attention remained on his round, bland, bespectacled face. And if I am a lady, then would you consider yourself a gentleman? Just my point. This country is mad for valuing people according to their titles. He continued to straight-lace the tan boot. Why should an idle so-called aristocrat be considered more of a gentleman than any thrifty, sober, industrious member of the working class? As he spoke this outrageous nonsense, I sensed passion beneath his cool exterior. Uncertain where it might lead, I asked cautiously, You are in favor of democracy, then? Shocking, if so, even to one who had been raised by a suffragist. But he replied, I scorn all such labels. Indeed, he almost sneered, setting down the tan boot, now appearing strangled in its own laces. I pigeonhole no one. I befriend no one. I befriend anyone, he said, rather viciously. And if someone needs help, I help them, whether they're a scullery maid or... The way he broke off gave me my cue. Lady Cecilia needed help. His hard voice lowered, as if not exactly softening. Flat tire on a bicycle that was all. When I was out running errands on my own, I patched hers with my kit, and we got to talking. Alexander! Roared a male voice close at hand. The young man in question lifted the delicate, fawn-coloured boot. To place an order, miss, all you need to do is post us a tracing of your right foot. Mr. Ebenezer Finch hove into view, ranting. Alexander, I told you... Oh. He broke off rather ungraciously. I see. You're helping a customer. How very odd. I thought that while the father was choleric, the son appeared so stoical, more than stoical, nearly wooden. After his father departed, without acknowledging the interruption in the least, the young man told me, Lady Cecilia was a serious sort of girl. She'd been reading Des Capital, and we discussed the exploitation of the masses. Des Capital. I had heard whispers of that book. It was considered shocking. No, beyond shocking. Not nice at all. Simply deplorable. However, as with many such topics mentioned only in undertones, life of ill repute, for instance, I had not the faintest idea what it was, actually. However, Mr. Alexander Finch did not seem to require my comprehension in order to keep talking. Lady Cecily considered our meeting most fortunate. She wanted me to show her the proletariat. Proletariat? A government building, perhaps? Not just domestics, clerks, and artisans, but the true toiling, downtrodden factory for the masses, Mr. Alexander went on. Naturally, I obliged her. We had corresponded, and over a period of time— Oh, I interrupted. I beg your pardon, is something wrong? Not at all, I had exclaimed, because now I saw how Lady Cecilia's charcoal drawings had come to be created. You took her to the dog district, and the workhouse, and St. Giles, and the fish market at Billingsgate. How did you know that? I saw a faint hint of a frown on his brow that had now until remained as smooth as new cheese. Yes, exactly, sir. She would go bicycling with her friends, arranging to meet me, and I would escort her to see how most people in this famous city live. Marx, I remember now. An appalling man named Karl Marx had written Das Kapital. Lady Cecily was a Marxist, I whispered, for this could not be spoken out loud. I have told you, I have no use for such labels. The young man's scorn of my intellectual capacity showed quite plainly. My apologies, I said meekly, for my upbringing as the disgrace of the Holmes family had made me quite accustomed to being looked down upon. Literally so in this case, as I sat in the bent wood chair, and Alexander Finch stood behind the counter. I am sorry to trouble you with so many questions. Just let me ask you this. Why did Lady Cecily wish to see the, proletariat? Why, for education she could not obtain elsewhere, of course. She asked endless questions. Why were there so many pawnshops? Why did the milkmaid lead a donkey behind her? What were drippings, and where did they come from? Why were children making bandboxes, and poor women sewing burlap sacks? But she must have wanted this knowledge for some reason. What were her plans? His tone, although still quite calm, became rather less pleasant. To make a whipping boy of me, by the looks of it, things. Not at all the answer I had expected. Whatever do you mean? Whatever could be plainer? He mimicked my dismay. She has gone off somewhere while I take the blame. Rather helplessly, I suggested. Perhaps she didn't realize you would be blamed. Why the latter, then? I sat silent, knowing all too well why the latter. So that Lady Cecilia's family, aware of her own, only as a girl who drew sugary pastels, would think she'd gone off with a seductive beau. Silly young thing. Whereas in truth, a young lady who read Marx might be capable of anything. I asked Miss Alexander. But did she not confide in you at all? Have you any idea where she was going? I don't know a thing about any of it, the young man said, arranging the boots so that they formed a straight line marching across the countertop. But what I think is, she walked right out to the front door and put that letter there herself. Chapter 9. On my way back to St. Pancras Station, I stopped at a bookstop. Das Kapital by Karl Marx, I told the portly gentleman behind the counter. He did not move. Indeed, he appeared to have, like various fairy tale unfortunates, turned to stone, except for his mouth, which opened and closed several times. I assure you, I told him, that after I have a brief look inside, I will fully intend to cover it in a baize and use it as a doorstop. His mouth settled into a disapproving line before he spoke. In English translation, miss, or in the original German? In English, of course. Did I look like a scholar? Did I sound like one? Oh dear, I must be more careful to control my gentrified accent, with which Alexander Finch had twitted me. I did not at all know what to think of Alexander Finch. I had been able to read very little in his face, but his manner was odd at times. Never quite improper, but quite subtly peculiar. Yet I felt sympathy for him, subject as he was to his father's temper. I admired his stoicism, and I appreciated his willingness to speak frankly with me. His theory that Lady Cecilia had left by the front door and placed the misleading ladder at her own window appealed to me. It was the sort of thing I would have done. All in all, however, leaving the bookshop with my heavy parcel, I felt that I had not learned much. And after scanning portions of Das Kapital that evening in the privacy of my lodging, I felt that, except for having learnt what proletariat was, namely the common people. Other than that, I knew rather less than before. Lady Cecilia convert to Marxism after reading this book. I had studied Hobbes, Darwin, even Winwood Reade's Martyrdom of Man with interest, but I must admit that Marx put me to sleep. Quite soundly I woke the next morning wondering what sort of intellect Lady Cicely might possess to be able to appreciate such rarefied rubbish. And what, considering some of his rather shocking statements, Alexander Finch had been reading. And if Lady Cecilia had indeed marched out the door of her own, and had she worn, and what had she worn, and where had she gone, and for what purpose? But such questions flew out from my mind, unresolved, as I sat in my office sipping my morning tea, and looking through the newspapers. From the personal column of the Poor Moor Gazette, I spied the following: 245255, 33151545, 3315, 4445154144, 12432445244423, 353144155133, 212452115, 45353424222345, 333545231544. Snatching for paper and pencil, I scrawl the alphabet in lines of 5 letters, then set to work. 245255. Second line, 4th letter, L. 5th line, 2nd letter, V. 5th line, 5th letter, Y. IVY. It was for me. Feverishly I worked out. Fully deciphered, the message said, Ivy meet me steps, British Museum 5 tonight, mother. Oh. Oh! So quick, so sudden, just like that, to see my mother again. I felt as if my heart had stopped, and just as quickly it started again, beating hard and quick like a regimental drum, as a thick porridge of conflicting emotions stirred within me. I loved Mum. I hated her. She had abandoned me. She had rescued me. She didn't love me, but she'd given me freedom, by slipping me a great deal of money and also by the way she had raised me. Her stubborn independence, her adamant championing of women's rights. Wait a minute. Ivy Meet Me Steps, British Museum 5 tonight, mother. The British Museum? That despised institution? Mum loathed the British Museum for its continual insults to female scholars. Steps, British Museum, seemed a most unlikely place for her to choose for a rendezvous. And in that moment, the moment down entered my mind, I discovered that, contrary emotions notwithstanding, I wanted to see my mother. Yearned to. I quite desperately tried to believe the message anyway, telling myself that mother had simply chosen the British Museum because it was a convenient meeting place, centrally located in a respectable area of the city. But at the same time, I could almost hear a remembered voice inside my head, adjuring me, Enola, think. I thought, and my thoughts provided no comfort. This message did not use our code of flowers in any way. Mum would not have said, meet me. She would have made some reference to either the scarlet pimpernel or the mistletoe, both long-time symbols of a triest. She would not have said, mother. Instead, she would have said, your chrysanthemum, meaning Mum. Inescapable conclusion. This message had not been placed in the newspaper by her. But I still wanted to believe it must have been Mum. Who else could have... Oh, no. I knew who. And thinking of him, my too clever brother, I needed to say something quite naughty. Oh, my stars and garters! Such was my degree of perturbation that it was difficult to keep presence of mind. I managed to muster that valuable commodity just sufficiently to scan the rest of the personal advertisements in all of the newspapers, in case there might be really something from Mum. There was not, of course. Indeed, it was a bit too soon. Previous missives have taken weeks or more to arrive. While I had no idea how or where the gypsies wintered, I pictured Mum somewhere far out in the countryside, requiring time to receive her publications by mail, deciphering my message, checking the train schedules, and post a reply. And as she would be coming into London by rail, would she not have asked me to meet her at, or near some railway station? Surely she would. British Museum humbug. Whoever had placed that advertisement had his own considerations in mind, not Mum's. Whoever, I knew well enough that it was Sherlock, although it took me a few hours and a headache to hypothesize how this disturbing turn of events might have come about, then decide what to do. Luckily, Dr. Ragaston's excellent secretary had kept Dr. Watson's address. Early in the afternoon, I took a cab to that worthy physician's office, finding myself let out in front of a modest practice and residence on a side street of northwest London. A page whom Joddy would have emulated for manners showed me into a small, slightly shabby waiting room and told me that the doctor was currently out, but should soon return, for his consulting hours began at 1. The casement clock in the corner read a quarter to that hour. I was glad to wait. As the clock chimed 1, a stout old lady with a goiter and an uniformed commissionary with a limp joined me in the waiting room. However, I was let into the doctor's consulting room first. Like his waiting room, it was small, just a trifle thread worn about the upholstery and draperies. Miss, standing up behind his desk to greet me, the kind-eyed doctor recognized me, but could not place me. Miss Meshel, from Dr. Ragston's office. Miss Meshel. His smile lighted his otherwise commonplace face, making it positively charming. Do sit down. He motioned me into the patient's chair and seated himself behind his desk again. And what may I thank for this unexpected pleasure? So open and friendly was his manner that I believed I actually blushed. I would have adored this man for a father. Until that moment, though I had often thought how nice it would be to have a friend, or family, I suppose, not eccentric and scattered, but real family that spent evenings reading in the parlour. Still, I hadn't realized I would have liked to have a father. My own father had passed away when I was 4 years old, and until that moment I hadn't particularly missed him. But I did, now. I'm afraid I must not take up much of your time, I told Dr. Watson, faltering a bit from surprise at my own feelings. Dr. Rackeston has reviewed your case and, sent me to ask you a question. By all means, I am delighted to hear of his interest, but yesterday I was just saying to myself that I must stop by his office and inquire. But now here you are, please do go on. Dr. Ragston would like to know, has Mr. Sherlock Holmes been following certain ciphers in the personal columns of the Pall Mall Gazette? Miss Holmes always reads the agony columns in all of the major newspapers, Watson replied. Yes, but any ciphers in particular? Did you notice anything upon his desk, for instance, when you visited him? Oh, yes, but that had nothing to do with the newspaper. Ciphers, yes, but it was a dainty little booklet of them, handmade, with watercolour flowers painted upon it. Not at all the sort of things one would expect to find Holmes working upon. More like a lady's hobby. Holmes quite snapped at me when I tried to have a closer look at it. It was as I feared. Feeling a bit weak, I closed my eyes. Miss Meshel, I know you said you're not here to consult me as a physician, but are you ill? Just a dreadful headache, Dr. Watson. Quite a headache indeed. The lady's hobby had to be my cipher book, created by Mum, and given to me upon my fateful 14th birthday in order, that is, its secret messages might tell me where her hoarded fortune was hidden. It was indeed my most precious memento of my mother, but my first day in London it had been stolen from me by a cutthroat while I was unconscious, and I had thought it lost and gone forever. Now, however, I saw what must have happened. When Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard had gone to arrest Cutter, he had searched the boat's cabin and he had found this flowery little booklet, incongruous enough in such a place that he had showed it to his friend Sherlock Holmes. Or perhaps the great detective had been there for the search and had seen the item in question himself, and had recognized his mother's handwriting. This, then, was how my brothers knew of my financial well-being. After solving the ciphers, Sherlock must have certain inquiries or investigations at a mutual childhood home, found her whore. At the same time, he had very likely deduced a connection with ciphers he had seen in the personal columns of the Pall Mall Gazette, ciphers that had mentioned chrysanthemum and ivy. Almost certainly he had solved them as well. He had been eavesdropping, as it were, on the communication between me and Mum. And now he had placed his own advertisement to bait a trap for me. Miss Meshel, Dr. Watson sounded concerned. You do not look well at all. After taking my pulse and inquiring what I'd eaten for luncheon, the good doctor gave me a bromide and had me lie down on the cot in his examining room while he consulted with his other patients. Perhaps an hour passed before he poked his head in and asked, "Any better?" Throwing off the knitted blanket with much he had covered my fully clad person, I sat up to speak with him. "Much better, thank you, Dr. Watson." This was the truth. The hour of rest had given me time to remember my mother's face, her habitual dictum, "Enola, you do quite well on your own," and thereby calm myself, and reach a decision and formulate a plan, for which I needed to be in position before 5 o'clock, and already it was past 3. Dr. Watson refused to accept a consulting fee from me. Thanking him profusely, I departed, walking to the cab stand at the corner. "Baker Street," I told the cabby. Once inside the four-wheeler, I drew the blinds. Then, while swaying along through London traffic, I removed from my personage as much of ivy meshel as I could. Off came my cheap straw hat, which necessarily sacrificed, stuffing it underneath the seat of the cab. Off came the fair hat, but false fringe of curls over my head, which I put into a pocket, and my chignon similarly stowed. Off came the green glass earbobs, choker necklace, and other baubles. From my bosom, where I have said I kept a variety of useful items, I pulled a scarf which I tied over my now unadorned head. I closed my mantle to cover most of my dress. I did, however, leave in my cheeks and nostrils the devices that stretched them into a fuller shape. Raising the blinds, I watched with interest, viewing my brother's lodging for the first time, as the cab trotted me past 221B, Baker Street, just another numbered doorway in a common hall of shops and residences, an ordinary enough place to house such an extraordinary person as Sherlock Holmes. But I waited until we had passed the next corner before I knocked on the ceiling to signal the cabby to stop. Once afoot, I walked back towards number 221, and on the opposite side of the street, hoping I would not have stopped to stand in the cold for very long. Also wondering how I could best linger without being noticed. In such freezing weather, there were fewer people about than usual, although newsboys still cried out for a living. "Horrible murder in Whitechapel, read all about it," and fishmongers pushed their barrels. "Fresh herring, live oysters, whelks," and all swathed in a long waterproof. A poor woman tried to sell trifles from a basket. "Oranges, bootlaces, novelties." I stopped to see what she had. Aside from aforementioned oranges that might better have been called browns, and bootlaces, she offered a quantity of pen wipers, made from the unusual scraps of fabric, but not in the usual squares. These were cunningly shaped like flowers and butterflies. "Clever," I remarked, fingering one. "Do you sew them yourself?" "That I do, ma'am, although me eyes have gone nearly blind by the labour of it." She hadn't been working by candlelight, firelight, or perhaps even out at night under a street lamp. Poor thing, for want of better illumination. Holding a blue cotton pen wiper shaped like a little bird, I asked, "How many have you sold?" "Not what I'd like, ma'am." Her chapped lips quivered. Indeed, we both stood shivering with the cold. "On the posh streets, where folk wouldn't miss a penny or two, the coppers drive me away, they do." "So you live hereabouts?" "No, ma'am. In Southwark, ma'am, but nobody wants me and wants them there." "I should think not." Southwark, on the other side of the Thames, was given over to disreputable theatres, gaming, bear-baiting, and the like. And once the woman returned to Southwark, no one who lived in Baker Street was likely to encounter her again. I told her, "I'll give you a guinea for the whole lot, basket and all, and I'll trade you my mantle for your waterproof." She gawked at me, but had the good sense not to ask questions. Off she went, rejoicing, wearing my mantle with a goodly sum of money in her fist, and off I went in a waterproof, carrying a basket and crying with a suitably cockney accent, "Oranges, bootlaces, novelties." A good ruse, and a necessary one, for I progressed up and down that block of Baker Street for a full 3/4 of an hour, and actually sold 2 pen wipers before I saw Sherlock Holmes emerge from his lodgings. Not in gentleman's dress, of course, but on his way to capture me, or so we thought. He disguised himself just sufficiently so that I would not notice or recognize him until it was too late. Therefore, he was got up as a common labourer, with a leather belt around his coat, a flannel shirt, and a cloth cap from under which his hair fell over his forehead. Striding off towards the British Museum, he passed me without a glance. Other than letting his forelock hang, he had not done anything to his face, and with a pang in my heart I saw that his hawk-like features did, indeed, look pale and harrowed, as his friend Watson had said. Silent, suffering a queer inward pain, I watched him walk by. I took a long breath, let it out again. Then I moved on. Pausing at a greengrocer's shop, I put down my basket with my foot, nudging it into a crate that was holding up a display of apples. Then I bought a slice of onion. Walking towards number 221, I concealed this in my handkerchief and held it near my eyes, which promptly began to water. Very good. Already at this cruel time of year, the streets lay in shadow. Doubtless my brother had chosen this hour in order to favour his scheme. Darkness would be falling when Sherlock reached the steps of the museum where... Oh, Mum! What if I'm terribly wrong? What if you're there waiting for me after all? The onion in my handkerchief proved unnecessary. At this thought, I started to cry. Chapter 10. An older woman, in a simple and respectable blouse and skirt, answered my knock, looking startled but not appalled to find me weeping on the doorstep. "Is Mr. Sherlock Holmes in?" I inquired between sobs. I had forgotten to speak in an accent, Mr. Holmes, befitting my appearance, but because of my tears, perhaps she did not notice. "Bless you, dear. He just went out." Wrapping a shawl around herself to speak with me, silver-haired Mrs. Hudson showed herself to be a kindly soul. I knew the landlady, of course, from Dr. Watson's writings, but remembered not to call her by name. I lamented. But I must see him this evening. I don't know when he'll be back, miss. I don't care. I am in such trouble. I'll wait. But it might be hours. Shivering despite her shawl, she retreated a few steps into the house, preparing to shut the door. Why don't you come back later? I'll wait. Whimpering, I plopped myself down on the icy doorstep. Bless you, dear, you can't wait there. You'll freeze. Come in, come in. As I had hoped, she led me upstairs and showed me into my brother's sitting room. Goodness, I murmured, forgetting myself in my surprise at the mess. I had never ventured into a bachelor's lodgings before. I knew, of course, from Dr. Watson's writings, that there would be tobacco, in the toe of a Persian slipper, no less, and a violin, instrument and bow laid carelessly across a chair, letters skewered by a jackknife to the mantelpiece, bullet holes in the walls, and so forth. But I found myself ill-prepared for what there was not. No flowers, no lace pillows, no ruffled skirts in the chairs. To be a man, apparently, was to lack the ability to be a woman. Mrs. Hudson tisked over the books and papers strewn everywhere. Mr. Holmes is tidy in his dress, and his personal habits, if not his housekeeping. She excused him. He's a real gentleman. Whatever your difficulty may be, he'll do his best to help you with it, miss. And never mind whether you pay him or not. Her words brought fresh tears to my eyes, for despite his trickery, I wanted to believe all goodness of my brother. Shall I take your wrap, miss? She started to lift it from my shoulders. No! I clutched the waterproof around me, for it concealed Ivy Meshel's too fashionable dress. No, I amended. Thank you. I'm cold. Well, miss, just have a seat, then. The sweet old soul cleared newspapers off an armchair near the hearth for me. I'll bring you some tea. She bustled out. No sooner had she closed the door behind me than I sprang up, crossing as noiselessly as I could to my brother's desk, impatiently blinking tears from my eyes. Through the blur I scanned a pile of papers, failing to find what I was looking for, as I tossed them aside. On the now clear desktop, I saw only the usual lamp and writing implements. The object of my search could have been anywhere in the room, of course, but I sensed that my brother, although he might toss his violin onto a chair, would take great care of an important clue. I tried his desk drawer. Locked. Reaching beneath my waterproof to draw my brooch, that is to say, my dagger, I inserted its stiletto-thin blade into the keyhole and probed the mechanism therein. I must admit I did not entirely lack experience in this art. An enterprising child raised amongst well-secured larders and sugar bins learns to pick locks. With a click, this one yielded to me. Returning my dagger to its concealment as brooch, I pulled open the desk drawer. I expected to see pen nibs, blotted paper, wooden ruler, things of that sort. Nothing of the kind met my eye. Instead, the drawer framed a sort of vignette of my brother's peculiar life. I glimpsed a revolver, a box of cartridges, a small bottle of some clear liquid lying on its side, a needle and a syringe, such as a doctor might use, in an open velvet-lined case, and a dainty framed photograph of a beautiful woman. An object of much curiosity to me when I had time to think about it. But I saw all these things only in memory. At the moment, my attention was all for what lay atop the array. With trembling fingers I grasped it, the precious, hand-painted, hand-lettered booklet of ciphers my mother had created for me. I wept anew, seeing it again. But there was no time for me to kiss it or hug it of any sort. Already I heard Mrs. Hudson's tread upon the stairs. Clawing my waterproof aside, I thrust the cipher book deep into my bosom. Closing the desk drawer, I took 3 soft, swift strides back to my armchair, and had seated myself with waterproof wrapped around me when Mrs. Hudson entered, carrying a tray. "Do have some tea, miss?" She poured and served me that life-sustaining beverage, and then, to my dismay, poured herself a cuppa, and sat down to keep me company. "Are you still cold, dear? Why don't you just slip that wrap back to your shoulders so you can enjoy your tea?" I shook my head, having no difficulty acting like an incoherent, nearly hysterical damsel in distress, for I was a bit distraught, but thinking, this will not do. I had perhaps overplayed my role. What if the sympathetic Mrs. Hudson planned to corset me until my brother returned? "Have a bit of walnut cake?" She offered a plate. Shaking my head again, I wavered. No, thank you. Miss..." Just in time, I stopped myself. "Hudson, dear. Mrs. Hudson, I wonder whether—" One cannot feign a blush, but no need. I flushed profusely, for I really am a shy person. "Nature calls," I mumbled. "Might there be—" "Oh, you poor thing, of course." Sweet soul, she jumped up. "Can you wait for just a few more moments? I must go. See to it." The water closet, I knew, would be located at the farthest end of the ground floor, by the back door for such indoor conveniences, let in the stench of the sewer. One does not want them near the kitchen or the parlor, and Mrs. Hudson needed to inspect its condition, perfuming it, and providing it with an ewer of hot water and a fresh towel, before she escorted me there. The moment the sound of her footsteps faded down the stairs, I got to my feet, tiptoed to the door of my brother's lodgings, and silently opened it. After listening, hearing nothing to alarm me, I slipped out, leaving the door ajar behind me as to not make an unnecessary sound by closing it. Trotting softly down the stairs, I made my escape out to the front of the house, without interference, for undoubtedly Mrs. Hudson was still busy trying to oblige my very embarrassing request. Probably she heard the heavy front door close behind me, but I ran, and was no great distance to the corner cab stand. The cabby looked askance in such an ill-clad fare, but I tossed him a sovereign and hopped into his four-wheeler. "The British Museum." Any astonishment or resistance on his part overcame by the gold coin in his hand. He promptly obeyed. I pulled the hood of my waterproof forward as far as I could to conceal my face. Impatiently, I wiped away my tears with my hands. Somewhere I had lost my handkerchief, onion and all. No more snivelling, I commanded myself. I was doing something risky, indeed foolish, and I needed to have my wits about me. The cab pulled up at the steps of the British Museum. Rather than getting out, I peered from the shadows of the cab. I had no problem spying my brother Sherlock lounging against one of the venerable institution's Grecian revival columns, puffing a cigarette the picture of a worthless idler. Very likely some constable would soon collar him and tell him to move on. As for Mum, there was no sign of her. If, by any chance, the message had come from her, if it had been intercepted by Sherlock, rather than originating from him, if Mum hadn't appeared, then obviously my brother would not be loitering where he was. With a sigh of relief, I smiled. I had been right all along. Mum was safe in the country somewhere, and Sherlock was trying to outsmart his disgraceful younger sister. When he went home, he would find out who was smart. The cab driver had appeared at the door. "Miss?" "Drive on," I told him. All that evening, by the warmth of my humble hearth fire, I cherished my reclaimed booklet of ciphers in my hands. Such bliss to see again that familiar first page bordered with Mum's daintily hand-painted gold and russet chrysanthemums, around her handwritten Aloe Neck O'Neill, MSM UMEHTN ASYRHC. And something new. On the page, Sherlock had penciled the solution. Enola, look in my chrysanthemums. On the next page, decorated windflowers, he had printed, See within my anemones, Enola. And so on, he had solved the cipher illustrated by the ivy on the picket fence. Enola, look in my bed knobs. Indeed, he had deciphered all the messages, including some I hadn't been able to. For a page decorated with pansies. Hearts, ease be yours, Enola, see in my mirror. With a pang, I wondered which mirror, and what my brother had found behind the mirror's backing. Perhaps not just a sum of money. Perhaps a note from Mum expressing regret, or farewell, or concern, even... I stopped myself, far short of the word love. Mum had more important things to do. She was a woman of character, intellect, and principle, a suffragist tireless in her devotion to matters concerning the rights of the fair sex, a free thinker and an artist, a very good artist, as evidenced by the lovingly, or to choose another word, the exquisitely rendered flowers adorning the booklet in my hands. While I adored Mum's handiwork, I found myself now turning my attention to my brother's notations. He had penciled them so lightly that I could have easily erased them, so that my cipher book would once again be the way Mum had given it to me. But rather to my surprise, I found that I wanted to keep Sherlock's intrusions. I wanted to possess something of my brother, if only his more precise lettering beneath my mother's artistic flourishes. Handwriting tells a great deal about a person, in my opinion, both that which is plain to be seen and that which may be hidden. I had been thinking of my brother Sherlock as the great detective, incisive and commanding, but his handwriting was smaller than my mother's. He did not think of himself as so very big. He might indeed be a bit shy in his way, as I was. Although severely logical, my mother's fanciful handwriting could have been put down to artistic temperament, but just the same, I thought, it showed her aspirations, her idealism, her dreams. But in my brother's printing, no dreams. He was the bleak realism of the scientist. Although I cautioned myself, under different circumstances, perhaps a letter to a friend, written instead of printed, would show more heart. People can have different handwritings. Look at Lady Cecily. Perhaps not the best example, her handwritings were too different. Her perfectly modest, correct, stylish notes and letters on the one hand, but then her big, childish, backward scrawls on the other. Hand. And suddenly, while I lounged half drowsily before my fire, with nary a thought of accomplishing anything to find anyone, up flashed a memory of Lady Cecilia's desk. As if my mind had slipped aside into a magical lantern, projecting an image, I saw the lady's lovely jaded handwriting implements, placed on the left, and quite clearly remembered seeing Lily, the too faithful maid, then shift inkpot, pennet, etc. over to the right. A shock of insight jolted me wide awake. I sat bolt upright staring. At my own desktop, dressing table, its very modest hairbrush, comb, jar of hand cream, and so forth, positioned upon the right side. Of course, because I am right-handed. But how had Lady Cecilia's silver embossed dresses had been placed? Oh, my stars, I whispered.